All right, why don't we get going? Again, welcome back to the science sessions. We have two more outstanding presentations scheduled in the next hour. We won't have a science session later this afternoon, as the WFO members meeting will be held at 3:30, and we will have science sessions tomorrow at 12:30 and 3:30. To remind everyone, please see the agenda tab on the conference website for the science program, which has the abstracts for all the presentations, contact information for the authors, and speaker bios. And finally, please remember to use the Q&A function to submit written questions as they come to mind during the presentations, and the speakers will answer those when they're done. So first up this afternoon, we have Dan Airola. Dan is a certified wildlife biologist who conducts research and conservation planning for at-risk bird species in Northern California. Dan is conducting long-term studies on purple martin and tricolored blackbird population status and habitat use, and has conducted research on a number of other bird species and issues. Dan is the editor of the journal Central Valley Birds and author of the recent book, Life Under the Fast Lane, Ecology and Conservation of the Bridge Nesting Purple Martins in Urban Sacramento. But today, Dan will be speaking with us about yellow-billed magpie population status and habitat characteristics in urban Sacramento, California. So please welcome Dan.
Hi, everyone. I need a little help getting my presentation up.
All right, you hit the share screen button. That should be.
There we go.
Okay, there you go. And then it'll give it to you as a choice.
Yep, got it. Thank you. Have to remember these things every time. And we'll get into. All right. So, hi everybody, and thanks for attending. As Steve said, I'm presenting on yellow-billed magpie population status and ecology. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Lily Douglas and my daughter, LAYLA AIROLA, and also the photographers who actually will make this presentation look a little better, Dan Brown and Stephen Fisher. So today what I'm going to do is give you an overview of how we got started, what we learned, and what does it mean. I'll start with a little brief natural history of yellow-billed magpies. Of course, they're beautiful and widely recognized by birders and non-birders alike. They are one of only two fully endemic California birds. Magpie has never been sighted outside of the boundaries of California. And even within the state, it has a limited distribution, the northern portion of the San Joaquin Valley, the Sacramento Valley, and the Central Coast region. Also, interestingly, it nests in colonies and forages in groups. So why is the magpie a species of conservation concern? Well, historically, it was persecuted and poisoned as an agricultural pest, and it suffered from substantial habitat loss due to agricultural conversion, to non-suitable crops, and to development. And this has restricted its range in some areas. But the recent threat has been West Nile virus. And I'll kind of describe to you here the recent history of populations and virus. The dotted line shows the incidence of West Nile virus activity since 2000, the year 2000. And the dark line shows populations of yellow-billed magpies based on Christmas bird counts. And so you see the decline begins soon after West Nile virus arrival. The species has not developed resistance to West Nile virus, unlike a number of other species that have recovered after declining. And in short, we face an 85% loss in the Central Valley population as of about 2019. But one aspect of its decline is that the pattern seems to be somewhat variable. And secondly, that the population appears to be stabilizing, but at this very low level. So my study, well, why did I start the study? In part because COVID canceled some of my other field work. I wanted a local project so I wouldn't have to be driving long distances, and yellow-billed magpies are around the Sacramento area. As we noted, they're in trouble due to West Nile virus, but what should I study? Well, I began by looking at local distribution, which has always intrigued me since I've lived here for over 30 years. Why are magpies where they are and where they are not? I looked first for areas where they were abundant as logical study sites, and I used eBird hotspot areas with the highest total magpies as my initial study areas. And I started just by counting numbers and observing foraging. I also looked into the details of what was known about about yellow-billed magpie ecology, and found that they have been extensively studied, but almost entirely in the Central Coast, and in fact, almost entirely within the Carmel Valley. The Central Valley work is very limited. It's consisted of population assessments after West Nile virus, the description of just 4 winter roost sites in the Sacramento region, but essentially nothing on foraging and nesting habitat or on what determines the abundance of the species in various areas. So the study goals for this first year of the study in 2020, which developed over time, were to first develop a census technique, determine the abundance using that census, describing foraging and nesting habitat, and attempting to evaluate if habitat conditions determine abundance. And if so, what specific conditions are related to abundance. So this is the study area in 2020 when I began. It consists of 7 study areas, again, where eBird numbers were high, 3 along Arcade Creek in North Sacramento, the North Sacramento metropolitan area, Discovery Park, where the American River dumps into the Sacramento River, and then 3 parks along the American River in suburban Sacramento. The census methods I came up with were 2. One was direct counts, going out and counting birds, which requires multiple visits because the birds are in flocks and you go out sometimes and you see them and other times you don't. So it takes a lot of work. I also did estimates just from counting nests, which is very effective during the period toward the end of nest building when these nests are readily visible in trees before they leaf out. So you basically have a 6-week period where you can count nests very effectively. The conclusions from this comparison of methods were that both performed somewhat similarly, but direct counts required much more effort, and estimates from nest counts are much easier to do and more repeatable. If you go back and count again, you get the same number of nests, which isn't the case with the birds themselves. Turning to foraging habitat use, I looked at use by the birds of different land cover types or habitats in relation to their availability on the landscape. This was within 5 kilometers of colony sites, or 1/3 of a mile. And what the yellow bars show are the percentage of observations of foraging birds in each of these types. And the orange shows the availability of those types within the study area. You can use this to determine preference and avoidance of various habitats. And what this shows is that irrigated turf and mowed or grazed annual grassland, which I refer to as low herbaceous habitat, was strongly preferred by magpies for foraging. Unmanaged grassland where the grass was high was used in about its proportion, whereas residential areas, pavement, woodland, golf courses, and water, obviously, were almost completely unused. The fact that golf courses were unused is kind of interesting because it had low herbaceous habitat. Let's turn next to nesting habitat. Here's a typical nest in a London plane tree, which is a non-native cultivar. 98% of nests were in trees, 2% in human structures. 89% of the nests were in deciduous trees. All the nests were at the treetops, usually of large, tall trees. 14 different tree species were used, and of those, about half were native and half were non-native. The 2 most commonly used trees were valley oak, which has been reported previously on the coast as the main nesting tree, but London plane, this non-native sycamore cultivar, had over 1/3 of the nests that I observed. So the conclusion is magpies will nest in any tall tree, preferably a deciduous one. We found 2 nests that had fallen from trees, or 1 nest tree that actually fell to the ground. And and we described those. The trees are large. As you can see here, it's a domed stick structure, quite large, weighing 16 pounds. It consists of 3 layers: an outer layer of sticks, an inner mud layer, which is substantial, weighing an average of 3.5 pounds at dry weight. And then inside the mud nest is a lined nest cup. Well, this is a tremendous amount of work to construct these nests. And in particular, remember this, in transporting mud to produce these substantial structures. We looked at populations versus the abundance of that low herbaceous habitat that we talked about was used for foraging. And at these 7 sites, you see a pretty good relationship is suggested there, which is consistent with those foraging results. We made a preliminary regression model to describe the relationship. One drawback is it did not explain the absence of the birds in many areas where we had this low herbaceous habitat. But I decided to go ahead and submit a paper to Western Birds and speculate about the cause of that. And then I had second thoughts and decided I really need to understand this better. So we went back in 2021, and with the purpose of refining the relationships between foraging habitat and population size, and to explain this phenomenon of magpies being absent from many areas with abundant low herbaceous habitat. And the primary thing that we determined was about the role of water in determining magpie occupancy and abundance. First of all, we noticed that all the 2020 sites, which remember were the sites with the largest numbers of magpies in eBird, they were all near rivers and creeks, flowing water. So we tested whether the distance to the water body and the water body type played a role in the local distribution and abundance of magpies. Now, this is a typical study site, which might surprise you. It's highly urbanized. This is an urban park. The birds are foraging in these areas of lawn, essentially, and nesting in large trees, either within the park, but also out in the neighborhoods. When we evaluated the effect, there is a stream running through this park, by the way. We evaluated the effects of different water sources and then refined the habitat population model accordingly. So this shows the effects of different water body types on occupation. And these are sites within within areas that had at least 4 hectares or 10 acres of this low herbaceous foraging habitat. And what you see is the sites near flowing water are almost all occupied if they have that foraging condition, whereas ponds and areas that lack water tend not to be occupied. So why is flowing water important? Well, we think there are 3 potential reasons. One is it's a drinking water source. Magpies drink regularly. Flowing water is fresher, more healthy than stagnant ponds that occur in other sites where we had fewer birds. Second is it provides a source of mud for nests. You see this island out here, which has recently been exposed. There's a perfect nest, a mud source for birds to carry all these dabs of mud one by one to their nests. Whereas the ponds that we observed were either concrete lined in these city parks, or they were overgrown with vegetation that obscured the birds from being able to acquire mud. The third possibility is that we know that flowing water doesn't support mosquitoes. And so areas near flowing water may in fact have less West Nile virus than other areas that are more stagnant and support more mosquitoes. So this is what the relationship between low herbaceous habitat and number of magpies looks like in sites near flowing water. Obviously, a good relationship. We developed a model, pardon me for presenting an equation, but you can handle it. This model predicts the number of breeding magpies based simply on the amount of low herbaceous habitat where you are near flowing water. And we did it for other types as well, away from water and near ponds. But what you see here is that first, that there was a strong statistical relationship. For those of you who know, an R squared of 0.62, which is pretty high. And the model shows that near flowing water, as the area of foraging habitat increases, magpie populations increase accordingly. The second thing that it does is it identifies a minimum area to support a colony of 3 pairs, which, remember, the birds nest colonially. So it requires about 4 hectares or 10 acres of habitat to support a magpie colony. Well, if I had mapped all this at the beginning, it might have made a lot more sense to me. But this map shows you the relationship of population, or I should say survey results in relation to water and amount of habitat. You see occupied areas are in blue. That squares are areas with less than 4 hectares of foraging habitat. The circles are with more. And you see the occupied sites are right along the river, and they have large amounts of foraging habitat for the most part. Areas away from the rivers, regardless of how much foraging habitat, do not support magpie populations. And areas adjacent to rivers that don't have 4 hectares of foraging habitat also are unoccupied. So it's a pretty simple but a powerful predictor here. So what are the implications of the study? Well, the first major question is, how can a population that's strongly affected by West Nile virus also show a strong relationship between habitat and population? There are several alternative explanations. West Nile virus could be affecting all populations proportionate to their abundance, but that's not really the way diseases work, from my understanding. And I think the more logical explanation for this is that sites near flowing water are not as affected by West Nile virus. And in fact, they may serve as a refugia from the disease. So that's an important finding. Populations are determined by foraging habitat area because disease is not as prevalent in these areas. So additional implications of this study: urban populations near flowing water may be healthier, and thus management should recognize and emphasize these areas. Second, the importance of irrigated turf. You know, turf is generally considered poor habitat and wasteful of water, but restoring turf to native habitat near flowing water could end up reducing the local magpie population. So retain turf near flowing water. And then third, grazing or mowing annual grasslands is beneficial as a management technique to encourage and increase magpie populations. And then finally, just in terms of general implications, the magpie is another example of a species that has adapted to human landscapes, but is nonetheless still very vulnerable. And sometimes people don't make that connection. Secondly, as a declining endemic species, the yellow-billed magpie is worthy of increased research and conservation effort. So with that, I will leave you with a unbridled sex picture to entertain you while I take questions if there's any time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Let's jump to some questions. First of all, could pesticide use explain the non-use of golf courses?
Oh, that's a perfect question. I just didn't have time to explain it. Yeah, my explanations are either a much heavier and more frequent mowing, which might discourage some of the insect populations. Pesticide use, although I've not researched how much of it occurs, I think it's probably pretty relevant. And the third is just safety. You know, maybe the birds are smart enough that maybe if a number of them are dinked by golf balls, they avoid it. But it was very surprising that birds so completely avoided golf courses. I do have to say that, you know, I wasn't playing golf, so I may not have surveyed those sites quite as intensively as other areas where I had better access. But I think my conclusions are correct about that.
All right. Another one. How did you determine the proportion of land cover types? That
was Lily Douglas's job. She's a GIS person, And I didn't have time to explain this, but we did 3 different layer distances, circles with 3 different distances around the centroids of each colony, and then did correlation analysis to say, at what distance are which land cover types most associate or show the best association with populations. And it was determined that that 0.5 distance had the best correlation. So anyway, that's what we did.
All right. Do you think the width of the riparian corridor plays a role in occupation or population size or density?
I don't think so at all. I mean, I think they need to have large trees to put a nest in, but other than that, it doesn't really matter. I mean, we had nests in parking lots, in backyards. It's the proximity to an adequate amount of foraging habitat that matters. But whether, the width of the riparian zone, I don't think is relevant, frankly. Didn't see any evidence of it.
There's a question, any corpses examined to confirm the link with West Nile? I guess the question is, is it well established that West Nile has affected these populations?
Yeah, it is pretty well established. The health departments, or I forget what they call them, collect mosquito abatement districts and such. They collect specimens and ask for reporting by the public. And again, I didn't have time to explain this, but one aspect of the study I didn't present was on reproduction, which is in the paper that's coming out in Western Birds. And it showed that reproduction seems to be similar in Sacramento to in the previous studies that occurred in the coast prior to West Nile. So it suggests that the birds are not being affected during the reproductive period. And that fits because most of the reports of carcasses that are reported and diagnosed as killed by West Nile take place in August, when mosquito populations, or at least the ones that transmit West Nile, begin to increase more rapidly for whatever reason.
All right. Do juveniles average more yellow skin around the eye, or is it variable with adults and juveniles?
I have only looked at that incidentally, but I think the answer is yes. Juveniles in their first year, I'm not sure up until when, show much more yellow around the eyes. It's a pretty good indicator. Yeah.
All right. And I have a question. Do you see any areas where magpies are expanding? And I say that because here in the Santa Clara Valley, where they aren't using urban habitats, there are areas where they've persisted and they're always there. They seem pretty stable, but they haven't then expanded back into areas where they've disappeared in the last 30 years.
Well, my study was localized here in areas where there were magpies, so I can't say for certain, but a couple of thoughts. One is that because the birds are colonial, they don't disperse and they don't travel great distances.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at vagrant records, you don't find that many of magpies considering their abundance. So they do tend to kind of stick close to home, which would discourage colonization of areas that are suitable. Another possibility, Steve, is that those areas are the areas where they're persisting. Perhaps, again, like my study, they're areas with flowing water and less West Nile, and the areas where they're absent. And we see this in the Sacramento Breeding Bird Atlas, by the way. The population collapsed, but persisted along the river courses and out in the broader open areas where the birds were maybe have been more reliant on ponds. They mostly disappeared. So they just may not be able to move into certain areas because of the virus load.
Since they adapted to living in some human-modified environments, how do you think they switched preferences from native habitats to turf, even though they originally lived in native habitats? Do they somehow prefer it?
Well, that's a good question. And, we don't know what magpies did before we arrived here. But I think that it's sort of an inherent characteristic for them to want to forage in areas with low cover because of protection from predators, ability to travel around, move through the grasses to search for prey. So, my guess is if you read the historical records that are all, of course, post-European arrival, the birds were, they were probably using riparian areas and foraging out in areas that were either exposed when floodwaters receded, or that might have had larger numbers of prehistorically tule elk and pronghorn, and then subsequently your livestock.
All right. And then last, Phil Unit reminds us to check out Dan's paper in the latest issue of Western Birds, which is now at westernfieldornithologist.org and arriving in your mailbox any second.
Yeah, I still haven't got mine, but maybe I should have mentioned it at the beginning. You could just read the paper and you wouldn't have to stay for the talk, but I appreciate those who did. So thank you, Steve.
Yeah, and last question, do magpies go to feeders? Are they affected by humans feeding them in any way?
Oh, that's interesting. Oddly, I have observed magpies feeding, believe it or not, at feral cat colonies, feeding on the cat food that people are putting out for feral cats. I don't think that's a net benefit somehow to the environment, much less them, but that happens. Another thing I'll mention that I didn't, because you just don't have time to say everything, is that livestock watering sources, are clean. They're pumped water regularly. And we did see several places in those sites away from rivers where it appeared that livestock watering sources substituted for flowing water by providing high quality water that we saw the birds using. So that's another human supplied benefit. I'll just lastly say, originally, my hypothesis was that magpie distribution was determined by crops, leftovers, orchards that had fruits or nuts. Turned out that's not true at all. So that part of it is not what I expected. But yes, in a limited way providing, the cat food thing is anomalous, but providing water would seem to be important to allowing them to persist.
And lastly, I'll just say that there's still so much, this demonstrates there's still so much that we have to learn about species that we see every day. And studies like this are fantastic. And, for the audience out there, pick a species and think about this kind of thing. And I know that's something that you've done very well over the years, Dan. So
yeah, it's a backyard species for me, but there are a lot of backyard species that people can collect meaningful data on, and they can get help in writing it up and publishing it in Central Valley Birds or Western
Birds. Yeah. Yes. All right.
So anyway, well, thanks a lot. Great questions. That was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks a lot, Dan.
Okay.
All right. Up next, our next presenter is Jennifer Ballard. Jen graduated from Washington State University with degrees in wildlife and range management. She earned an MS in wildlife at Colorado State University, studying the impacts of understory on birds and small mammals in riparian forests in Colorado. Jen is the monitoring coordinator for Great Basin Bird Observatory, and almost every year at this conference has something to present to us, which is fantastic. Today, she'll be speaking with us about the effects of pinyon-juniper removal treatments on birds in the Pine Nut and Desatoya Mountains of Nevada. So welcome, Jen.
Well, thank you very much. All right, let me just come here and share my screen. There we go. Okay. So I'll be talking about the effects of pinyon removal on these birds. I'll start off talking a bit about pinyon-juniper removal in general, and then I'll move on to talk about our particular study area and methods and what we found. Oops, hold on. Why are you not? There we go. So removing pinyon and juniper trees is a really common management activity here in the Intermountain West, and for a number of reasons. Land managers typically prescribe it for things reducing fire danger, improving habitat for species like mule deer, and perhaps most commonly to try to restore sagebrush and sage-grouse habitats. It's kind of a complicated and sometimes controversial situation. There's some disagreement over to what degree and where pinyon-juniper habitats have been expanding into sagebrush habitats relative to European American settlement. But it's also true that greater sage-grouse, for example, respond poorly to sagebrush habitats that have had pinyon-juniper encroach on them. And so obviously sage-grouse are a really important conservation priority here in the Intermountain West. But while sage-grouse are a declining species who are harmed by pinyon-juniper encroaching into sagebrush, we also have pinyon-juniper species like pinyon-jay who appear to require those habitats. So bringing this around to our project then, because of all of these factors, there have been substantial pinyon-juniper removal projects ongoing within Nevada. And so the Bureau of Land Management then really wanted to know what effect were all of these management actually having on the bird communities, and that was where we came in. So what I'll talk about today is an exploratory meta-analysis of 4 different projects. 3 are in the Pine Nut Mountains in Western Nevada, and then 1 is in the Desatoya Mountains in Central Nevada. So here is a close-up view of our Pine Nut Mountains projects with Buckskin Valley, which started in 2019, and then our uplands and drainage projects that started in 2014. And here is a close-up of the Desatoya Range, where our projects are including both upland and drainage transects. So we're using point count transects, typically 10 points with 10 minutes per point. Not all transects were surveyed each year. And overall, we had 226 surveys across 53 transects between 2012 and 2019. So again, meta-analysis using mixed effects, repeated measures modeling, and we used it on a point basis. And then in late summer 2014, the bison fire ripped through a chunk of the Pine Nut Range and burned a bunch of our points. So to avoid diluting our treatment results, with wildfire impacts, we actually ended up then taking all of the points then completely out of the analysis. So here's a list of the variables that we looked at. And so most of them are landscape. We do have 2 variables there. So we've got day, so early, before 8 a.m. Versus late, so 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. And then we have season, early versus late, before or after June 15th. There are also we ran 2 separate model runs. One used treatment status, so was pinyon-juniper removed. And then we also looked at years post-treatment, so untreated, 1 year post-treatment, 2 to 3 years, and 4 to 6 years. So we looked at, there was a bunch of different things to think about with pinyon-juniper removal in our study area. So we had removal from pinyon-juniper dominated sites. Often these were thinning for reduction of fire danger. We had removal from substantial sagebrush, often for sagebrush and sage-grouse restoration. And then removal from drainages, which could be in either of those 2 categories, or it could be montane riparian. And then how we evaluated removal was what occurred within 100 meters of our survey location. And so sometimes we had, it was entirely cleared. Sometimes it was cleared from just a portion of the point, or sometimes it was thinned. And just for sample size, everything is just lumped together. So right now I'm going to share with you stack of photos. I'm just going to whiz right through them, but just to kind of give you an idea of the landscape that we're looking at, and then also to show you what some of these post-treatment areas will look like. Okay, so going into what we found, overall, we had 2 community measures that we looked at. So we looked at overall abundance, so total number of detections, and we looked at diversity. And it ended up that the models for both of those were exactly the same. So for overall abundance and diversity, detections, those were higher on points where the initial habitat was dominated by pinyon-juniper, where the pinyon-juniper was untreated, and on points that were in drainages. There was an apparent gradient. So detections were highest on untreated points, and then lowest on points with 4 to 6 that were treated 4 to 6 years prior, with 2 to 3 years post-treatment sites in between. And again, the same was true with species diversity. So moving into our pinyon-juniper birds, we'll start off with Buick's wrens. Detections were higher on points within the Pine Nut Mountains, where the initial habitat was dominated by pinyon-juniper and where that PJ was untreated, and in low elevation drainages. Gray flycatchers were, detections were higher on points in the Desatoya Mountains, again, where the initial habitat was dominated by pinyon-juniper and was untreated, and then in lower elevation uplands. Juniper titmouse surprised me. So we saw substantially different results between the 2 model runs. So both model runs indicated that there were higher detections at lower elevations. The years post-treatment indicated that initial habitat of pinyon-juniper was significant, and the treatment status indicated that untreated pinyon-juniper was significant. So mountain chickadees, detections were higher on points that were in the Desatoya Mountains, where initial habitats were dominated by pinyon-juniper and where that was untreated, and then higher elevation points. Survey characteristics were, detections were higher on points that were surveyed after June 15th and on surveys that began after 8 a.m. Pinyon jays were another really interesting one, and this again was one where there were substantially different results between the 2 model runs. So both of them indicated that detections were higher on surveys that were started after 8 a.m. The years post-treatment model also contained significant initial habitat of pinyon-juniper, and that actually detections were higher in older treatments that were 4 to 6 years old relative to untreated, which I thought was fascinating. Then we looked at a group of pinyon-juniper birds. So we looked at mountain chickadee, black-throated gray warbler, gray flycatcher, and juniper titmouse. And detections for these birds were higher on points in the Desatoyas, again, where initial habitat was dominated by pinyon-juniper and where that was untreated, and then in uplands. So there was a gradient here. So detections were highest on untreated points, lowest on points that were treated, 4 to 6 year old treatments, with 2 to 3 year old treatments in the middle. So moving on to our shrubland birds. We'll start off with brewer sparrows. Detections were higher on points, unsurprisingly, where the initial habitat included substantial sagebrush, and where pinyon-juniper had been removed. They were also detected more on higher elevation uplands. We did see a gradient, so detections were highest on points that were 4 to 6 years post-treatment relative to 2 to 3 years and untreated. We did see some interaction. So at higher elevations, there were more detections after June 15th. And 2 to 3 years post-treatment, there were actually more detections in drainages than in uplands, and made me wonder whether or not that might be an indicator condition post-disturbance. Black-throated sparrows, again, detections were higher where initial habitat included sagebrush and where pinyon juniper had been removed, and lower elevation uplands. And our final species was the green-tailed towhee. Again, significant sagebrush, higher elevation uplands, and surveys after, detections were higher on surveys after June 15th. There were also significant interactions here. So there were more detections in uplands that were untreated. And then again, we have this 2 to 3 years post-treatment drainages supported greater detections than did uplands. We did not do a group of sagebrush birds because when I looked at the numbers there, 85 to 90% of them were actually brewer sparrows. So they were just swamping everything. So we just stuck with species specific work here. So in conclusion, looking at our overall community values, we had total detections and diversity, highest on points that were dominated by pinyon juniper, were untreated, and were in drainages. And there was some evidence of a gradient there with detections higher 2 to 3 years post-treatment relative to 4 to 6 years after treatment. And then when we look at pinyon juniper associated species, where the mountain range was significant, we had more species detected in greater numbers than the Desatoyas, with the exception of Buick's wrens. Most species had significantly higher detections on points that were originally pinyon juniper dominated, not a surprise. But the fact is, juniper titmouse and pinyon jay only had one of the two models showing a habitat effect was a surprise. Most species had significantly higher detections on untreated points, again, with the exception of juniper titmouse and pinyon jay. Juniper titmouse, only one of the two models showed a treatment effect. And then pinyon jay, interestingly, showed some evidence of higher detections in treatments, which was a surprise. So most species did not show a topographic effect. Buick's wrens, with the exception of Buick's wrens, were found more in drainage areas, and gray flycatchers more in upland areas. And most species were found in the lower elevations below 7,000 feet, with the exception of mountain chickadee. And the only species showing a seasonal effect was mountain chickadee. And so possibly related to elevation and phenology up there. Similarly, most species did not show a time of morning effect, again, with the exception of the mountain chickadee, which was found more after 8 a.m. Possibly that's something else to do with high elevation and temperatures. And then the pinyon jay was also found more after 8 a.m. And that's probably because, they've got massive home ranges. So that's probably indicating them flying from their nest or roosting site over to the survey locations to forage. With shrubland species, again, not surprisingly, all species were detected significantly more on points originally with substantial sagebrush. 2 of the 3 were found more in treated points, with the exception of green-tailed towhee. All species were found significantly more on uplands, and 2 of the 3 were found significantly more at higher elevations, with the exception of the black-throated sparrow. Both of those species that we found more at higher elevations also showed at least some evidence of higher detections, greater number of detections after June 15th. Again, phenology related. So what are the implications of this? Moving pinyon juniper from sites with substantial sagebrush tended to result in increased detections of shrubland birds, including the conservation priority species brewer sparrow. There was an exception of green-tailed towhees where they were found, where more were found, in untreated uplands. Having a slide problem. And regarding our pinyon juniper associates, removing pinyon juniper from PJ dominated sites tended to result in lower detections of pinyon juniper associated birds, including gray flycatcher. A fascinating exception was the pinyon jay, where there was some evidence that we had more detections from pinyon juniper dominated sites, and detections were higher in 4 to 6 year old treatments as compared to untreated sites. So it's possible that opening up these pinyon juniper dominated sites might increase resources to trees, and then after several years of this, those pines might be able to produce more cones and seeds for foraging. However, because we were doing surveys across 2 mountain ranges, but these guys have enormous home ranges. And so we're only dealing with a handful of flocks. So in order to kind of really nail that down, we would want to expand this to more mountains, more mountain ranges, and more flocks to try and see whether this pattern holds true. And with that, I would like to thank all of the surveyors who have helped us collect the data for this project, the BLM, Nevada Department of Wildlife, and Zoe and Ned for their help. And with that, are there any questions?
Thanks a lot, Jen. There are some questions. One, hasn't most pinyon juniper removal been done to increase forage for cattle grazing?
There certainly is that as well. Yes, that's not a lot of the projects that we're looking at now, though, are not actually for cattle. There's a lot of concern about the impacts of pinyon juniper encroaching onto sagebrush and the impacts that is having on the sage-grouse population.
All right, similar question or follow-up. What is the original evidence that PJ is encroaching on sagebrush, and what is the rate of advancement?
So that's again when I was kind of talking at the beginning of this, that there is some controversy about this. People are disagreeing in terms of looking at what are the baselines of that folks are looking at. So there certainly has been an expansion of juniper since, like, say, the early 1900s. But then some folks have also been able to find records from prior to that era, that show that maybe that's not quite as simple as that.
All right, and when the PJ is removed, is it just thinned, or is there a certain amount of PJ cover that is intentionally left?
It depends on the purpose of the pinyon juniper removal project and the specific prescription for that site. So for some sites, the plan is to thin it, and so they are leaving some portion of those trees on the site, and others they're just taking everything out, and then somewhere in between.
Has the pattern of clearing, such as in large blocks versus strips, been evaluated?
Large blocks versus strips. That is a good question that I cannot answer for you. Certainly folks are starting to look at ways in which if when you're looking at pinyon juniper kind of stringers down into sagebrush, some of the older removal projects just sort of like created this very defined line between here is pinyon juniper, here is sagebrush, without kind of any feathering, like creating an ecotone basically. And so we do see more projects that are trying to create that ecotone.
How rapidly does the PJ regenerate in the areas from which it is removed? And is the pinyon jay essential to this regeneration?
So yes, pinyon jays are really important for the expansion of pinyon into areas. I think that the speed of that is going to depend on particular site-specific characters. So I'm not able to actually talk about the speed of that. I think there was another part of that question that I missed.
Let's see. Is the pinyon jay essential, and how rapidly does the PJ regenerate after it's removed?
Yeah. So yes, they are really important for that. As to speed, I can't really say. It's going to depend to a certain degree on what pinyon juniper is left basically, and in most places it's fairly close by, but still.
So given that there are species of conservation concern in both the extensive sagebrush and the PJ, how do you balance both sagebrush and PJ to help both species, both groups?
That is such a great question, and that really is being worked on, and it's something that the BLM here in Nevada is very keen on doing, and there are a lot of talks with USGS, and various researchers are coming up with actually decision support tools that are combining both sage grouse needs and pinyon jay needs, among other species, to make it so that we are evaluating on multiple levels and not just like on a one species kind of basis.
That's good. Can you elaborate further on why pinyon jays might be responding positively to clearing?
So, okay, so it's so again, they were found significantly more in at least one of those model runs. They were found significantly more where on points that had pinyon juniper, and not ones that had substantial sagebrush in them, and sites that had older treatments on them. And so my thought is that this is not a site, these are not sites that have been clear cut, that these may be sites where there's been partial cutting or thinning. And so that is allowing, for example, more water and so on, to more resources to allow those pinyon and juniper to be healthier, and of those, the pinyon pines may then be producing more cones after enough time. So again, that's speculation, and this is very early. We need a lot more data to try and say whether or not this is truly happening, but it is it's an intriguing arrow to go in a direction to go look.
All right. The Pine Nut Mountains are the established place where California scrub jays and woodhouses jays come together and hybridize. Can you say anything about those jays from the Pine Nut Mountains after the fire or after treatments?
Oh, that is a great question. Off the top of my head, I can't, but I might next time around.
There you go. Oh, that'd be great. That would be great.
So we started looking at them. I just haven't pulled together those results yet, is why I say that.
All right. That's great. Well, let's hear about that next year.
Exactly, exactly.
Good. Next year when, and I'm sure it's when the conference will be in and hopefully focus greatly on the Great Basin. Which would be
Absolutely.
good. Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Jen,
All right. Thank you, everyone.
thanks a lot. Thanks to both Jen and Dan today. Two fantastic talks that engendered a lot of questions, which is good. So that ends our science sessions for today. And John Harris will tell us what's up next.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, and thank you to our presenters. We'll be taking a break until 2 o'clock when Alex Cho and Aaron Gompertz will be presenting on basics of bird photography. So we'll see you there.